I want to tell you the story of our Accidental Revolution. The Accidental Revolution was a radical transformation of the British Constitution. Executive government controlled by a hereditary monarch was replaced with executive government conducted by ministers appointed on the advice of a prime minister. The prime minister being appointed by the monarch on the basis of representation in the House of Commons. The ministers all serve at the mercy of the House of Commons. I call this revolution accidental because I can't see that anyone set about achieving it, although it certainly resulted from very many determined efforts by generations of British politicians to secure aspects of it. It was constitutionally momentous, but its gradual unfolding disguises its importance. If it had happened all at once, any monarch would have viewed it as a shocking revolution. While it depended on the Glorious Revolution, the Accidental Revolution was far more important. It was, in fact, the emergence of responsible government. By responsible government, I mean government that has met the main challenge for a constitution. The challenge of preventing the rulers from acting selfishly in their own interests. We should not expect too much from a constitution. Let's say that it secures responsible government when it opposes selfish governance to some acceptable extent, and does so in the ways that we can reasonably expect from a mere constitution. Good government is a different matter. Democracy is a different matter. The Accidental Revolution did not give us either of those, but it made them possible. Democracy and good government are impossible without responsible government. The Accidental Revolution was basically carried through in the years between the framing of the US Constitution in 1787 and the framing of the Canadian Constitution in 1867. And its significance is disclosed and exemplified by the fact that while the Americans rejected the Westminster model in 1787, the Westminster model was exactly what the Canadians wanted 80 years later, after the Accidental Revolution was brought about. You will quickly see that I am adopting a simplifying schema to make a point. The Accidental Revolution had begun before 1776, and it was not altogether complete in 1867. And the leaders of the Canadian colonies wanted the Westminster model partly because they were Empire loyalists, and partly because they thought London would agree to it, and partly because they simply wanted to be different from the Americans. Yet, this simplifying schema has a germ of truth. Even a century after the Glorious Revolution, in 1787, the UK Constitution was not even capable of being fit for purpose. In 1867, it was. And this great transformation was the establishment of responsible executive government. Let's explore the constitution of a foreign country, England, between 1787 and 1867. Our Baedeker, our well-thumbed travel guide and constant companion, will be Walter Bagehot's book, The English Constitution. It is useful to us partly because of his political percipience and his terrific journalistic energy. It's opinionated, candid, articulate about Bagehot's own prejudices, and like any useful travel guide, it is full of local knowledge. Bagehot penned his revealing sketch of the Constitution in 1867, the very year of the British North America Act, which I will say the Accidental Revolution was substantially complete, and when the Westminster model was first used as the model for the creation in a colony of an institution called Parliament. Bagehot's world was shaped by the prelude to the Accidental Revolution, which was the Glorious Revolution 1688. That revolution entrenched parliamentary control over revenue, and it protected Parliament by a Bill of Rights, mostly the rights of MPs. I think that the Glorious Revolution made the Accidental Revolution inevitable. Running a government would come to depend on support in the House of Commons. Yet King William and Queen Anne were still appointing ministers whom they chose for their own political purposes. By Bagehot's time, Victoria was appointing as her Prime Minister the leader of the party with control in the House of Commons. That was the central facet of the Occidental Revolution. You may think that it is surprising that it took 2 centuries to come about. It must have taken so long because the Glorious Revolution upheld the restoration of the monarchy. It was a revolution because William and Mary got the crown in 1689 by vote of an irregularly convened parliament and on condition of a transformational deal that made Parliament supreme. But the restoration really took root. The English really did want William and Mary to be king and queen, and William really ruled. So there was a deep, significant constitutional discontinuity later between William and Queen Victoria, and it did not happen soon or all at once. William deliberately mixed Whigs and Tories in his ministry to dilute party influence. In the 18th century, Anne and the Georges wanted to run the government, and at first they were wary of having Prime Minister, a man who might see himself as running the government. To this day, the UK has 6 Lords Commissioners of Her Majesty's Treasury, because George I thought that a single Lord High Treasurer would act too much as if he was running the government. William and Anne attended cabinet meetings. The Georges did so less and less, and so it became conventional for the king to receive an accounting of cabinet proceedings from the Prime Minister. In those early days, before the Occidental Revolution, a charismatic minister could manipulate the creative tension between king and parliament. In the 1730s, Sir Robert Walpole cemented his credentials as the first Prime Minister by denying unequivocally that he was a Prime Minister. By the time of Sir Robert Peel in the 1830s, the English had got used to the title and the Occidental Revolution was underway. Even under the Georges, the Prime Minister needed the confidence of the king. It was not so clear that he needed the confidence of the House of Commons. Walpole actually resigned in 1742 after a vote in the House of Commons that he treated as a vote of no confidence. But that seems to have been viewed at the time as a choice made for political reasons rather than a constitutional obligation. Even in 1784, William Pitt the Younger could brazen it out as Prime Minister after a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons because he still had the king's confidence. And the germ of truth in my simplifying schema is that in the long reign of George III, from 1760 until his son became regent in 1810 because of his mental illness, if the king's ministers could not get the king's business done in the House of Commons, that was only a recipe for political difficulties. By the end of Victoria's reign, it was an established rule of the Constitution that the government had to be led by ministers who had the support of the House of Commons. That is why the Americans thought that the Westminster model was repugnant to constitutionalism in the bad old days of George III. But the Canadians wanted the Westminster model 80 years later. When the 13 colonies rebelled, George III was still supervising the operation of government, and he saw it as his prerogative to choose ministers for state purposes as he conceived them. In fact, he tried to control the Parliament and to some extent succeeded. As Sir Ivor Jennings put it, by using patronage, honours, control over royal officers in elections, and even bribery, the King and his Prime Minister, Lord North, were able to manage Parliament for a long period. It seems to me that Lord North was a servant of the King who had to manage Parliament. Victoria's Prime Ministers were leaders in a House of Commons that had changed dramatically since 1760 and could not be managed by a monarch. It had become the center of governmental power. At the time of Canadian Confederation, in 1867, when Bagehot wrote his book, the Westminster model had developed these crucial elements which were either missing or unsettled in 1787. First, a convention that the Queen would appoint as Prime Minister the head of the party with a majority in the House of Commons, if there was one with a majority. Secondly, a convention that she would appoint her other ministers on the Prime Minister's advice. And thirdly, a convention that her ministry would resign collectively on a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons. And, crucially, a convention had developed that she would act on her minister's advice, not only in the exercise of what we might call everyday governmental power, but on constitutionally important prerogatives, such as her appointment of peers and her dissolution of Parliament. And all this is exactly the same in 2020, subject to the distorting influence of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act 2011, which I say with apologies to anyone present who may have voted for that bill in Parliament. George III seems to have viewed his exercise of the power of dissolution of Parliament as a matter on which he could advise himself. Victoria did not. Bagehot, I'm glad to say, provides support for my claim that the Occidental Revolution had secured its effect by 1867. Though the rule of Parliament was definitely established in 1688, yet the mode of exercising that rule has since changed. At first, Parliament did not know how to exercise it. The organization of parties and the appointment of cabinets by parties grew up. I think that's right. I think that's a good picture of the change between 1688 and 1867. I hasten to add that the Occidental Revolution was not altogether complete by 1867. Even in the 1890s, Victoria could resist Gladstone's wishes on the choice of her ministers, and she objected to the extension of parliamentary control over foreign and colonial affairs and over the army. She seems to have thought that she was actually in charge of imperial affairs. But the Occidental Revolution had been a success. At least enough of a success to make the Westminster model look to the Canadian leaders like a useful model of responsible government. Perhaps the constitutional implications were not fully apparent, although Bagehot disclosed some of them to an avid public. I think that his book shows that there were ramifications for all aspects of the Constitution. The following ramifications, which he mentions, are still the same in 2020. He said that the most important function of the House of Commons is its role in the appointment of the executive. I think that's true today. Secondly, there is a special constitutional importance, he said, to the functions of our executive in augmenting the peers. It was really important, even in 1867, that the Prime Minister had a way of managing the House of Lords. Thirdly, the role of the monarch. Bagehot said, "The crown is of no party. Its apparent separation from business is that which removes it both from enmities and from desecration, which preserves its mystery, which enables it to combine the affection of conflicting parties, to be a visible symbol of unity." Before we turn to the constitutional implications of this change, let me just briefly mention the aspects of those days between 1787 and 1867 that led to this transformation, or perhaps we should say the conditions that made it possible for British politicians to bring it about. This is the question for real historians. I'm certainly not going to answer it, but I can point out some obviously important and interrelated aspects of those turbulent times which I tend to think must explain why the Occidental Revolution happened. First, the loss of the 13 colonies. generated a very complex, long-running, and significant public introspection of a new kind in England. And of course, so did the French Revolution. And then the revolution sweeping Europe in 1848. Secondly, industrialization combined with the consolidation of an empire that had been won in the 1700s generated massive wealth and massive poverty, with resulting demands on government that could not effectively be met by an administration led by a monarch. Thirdly, the religious and cultural and political background supported a rivalry between Whigs and Tories and supported their development from tendencies into political organizations. Finally, there was a string of weak monarchs. I presume that Bagehot is right, I couldn't comment, that George III and his two sons, George IV and William IV, reigning from 1760 to 1837, were downright weak. Bagehot says that George III interfered unceasingly, but he did harm unceasingly. George IV gave no steady continuing guidance and was unfit to give it. William IV was an exceedingly weak king. The Occidental Revolution worked itself out through the maneuvers of a series of powerful prime ministers in the 19th century, vying with powerful leaders in their own parties and in opposition, and advising relatively weak monarchs. Prime ministers became leaders in Parliament who managed the king, rather than servants of the king who managed Parliament. Finally, and perhaps this was most important, and it's related to all the other developments, the two great Reform Acts of 1832 and 1867 didn't just open up the franchise quite significantly. They responded to and they augmented a shared national sense that the franchise mattered, and therefore that the people's representatives in the House of Commons were in charge of government and responsible for it. Perhaps the turning point in the Occidental Revolution was 1832. Bagehot emphasizes the constitutional significance of that episode. William IV was constrained by politics to agree to accept his Prime Minister's advice to swamp the House of Lords with new peers, to force the aristocrats to agree to make the House of Commons into a more representative body. That was a critically important instance of the effect of the Occidental Revolution. What was the result? The first problem of constitutionalism is how government can be configured to be not entirely selfish. The UK under Victoria had accomplished that. Queen Anne's government was focused too much on Anne's understanding of Anne's interests as monarch. The focus of Queen Victoria's government was not on Victoria's interests. Her interests were conceived by all involved to be identical with the interests of the empire, which were articulated in Parliament. And here is the critical point. The Occidental Revolution had not made the Prime Minister into a sort of appointed monarch. The focus of Queen Victoria's government was not on Gladstone's interests or Disraeli's interests either, because of the predicament in which they exercised their great power. They had to respond to the interests of others. Let's pause to remember the difference between responsible government and good government, which responds rightly to all the relevant interests. I'm not saying that Victoria's empire achieved good government, or government that paid attention to the actually relevant interests. But we can say this: her prime ministers were not in a position to run the empire by their own arbitrary say-so. That created the opportunity for democracy. It created the opportunity for good government. All it achieved was responsible government. Here is Bagehot's interpretation of the solution to this problem of constitutionalism. It is the central idea in his book. The efficient secret of the English Constitution may be described as the close union, the nearly complete fusion of the executive and legislative powers. The connecting link is the cabinet. By that new word, we mean a committee of the legislative body, selected to be the executive body. The legislature has many committees, but this is its greatest. He presents this as a revelation, and he would, I am sure, agree that it was a result of a radical constitutional transition since the days of George III. It's a penetrating insight, but I wish he had not described it as a fusion. Generations of Balliol law students have told me in their constitutional law essays that the UK has no separation of powers between legislature and executive. And I think they say that because 21st century textbooks are still passing on to them Bagehot's central bright idea. The students come to think that the legislature is run by the executive, or that the executive is functionally identical with the legislature. But in fact, there is not only a critical connection between executive and legislative power in our Constitution, which Bagehot identified, there is also a very deep and significant separation of executive and legislative power in our Constitution. One simple way of putting it is that in the House of Commons, there is an opposition with a capital O, and in the executive, there is no such thing. If you ask Theresa May whether leadership of the cabinet confers leadership of the legislature, I think you would get a dry, hollow laugh. In a rather better pair of metaphors, Bagehot called the cabinet a hyphen which joins, a buckle which fastens the legislative part of the state to the executive part of the state. And the buckle, the result of the Occidental Revolution, was essential to the Constitution under Victoria, and is likewise essential today. But it is no fusion, and it doesn't quite have the fixity of a buckle. It is always under negotiation, especially in times of political crisis. I think that is its strength. It is always being worked out in the context of electoral politics, so that the next election is daily being fought in the House of Commons in debates over the operation of the executive. That happens even at the beginning of a parliament in which there is a strong majority. The next election is being fought out. Bagehot showed that in his accounts of Victorian political crises. In addition to the metaphor of a fusion, Bagehot made a second misinterpretation, or so it looks to me. He repeatedly described the cabinet as a committee of the legislature. A cabinet government is the government of a committee elected by the legislature. I think, to the contrary, that it is very significant that the cabinet is not elected by the House of Commons, and that it is very definitely not a committee of the House of Commons or of Parliament. The constitutionally significant difference is threefold. First, the Prime Minister is not elected by the House of Commons. The MPs can vote a Prime Minister out, but they do not vote a Prime Minister in. That act, if they did it, would be a very significant constitutional act, and it doesn't happen in our Constitution. They don't elect the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is appointed by the Queen in accordance with a convention determining whom she is to appoint. It is no act of the House of Commons that appoints a Prime Minister. The appointment results from the sheer brute fact of numbers in the House of Commons. Or rather, from the sheer brute fact of numbers combined with what I would say, with respect to Bagehot, is the real, actual, efficient secret of this Constitution: the operation of political parties. That is what makes it possible for the Queen to know who can command a majority of the House of Commons and serve as a head of the executive government in subjection to the House of Commons. The parties, I call it a secret because the party system is not even covered in our constitutional law course in the university, but it is absolutely indispensable to the Constitution today. as it was in 1867. The party system determines the appointment of a prime minister by, for example, making it the case that when the Conservatives won a majority in the House of Commons in the December 2019 general election, Boris Johnson had majority support in the House of Commons and the Queen knew whom to appoint. And when there is no majority, the parties can make it possible for her to do that by forming an agreement like the Cameron-Clegg agreement in 2010. The House of Commons function is not elective, although it is constitutive of the executive. That is the centerpiece of the Occidental Revolution. Secondly, the other ministers of the cabinet are not appointed by the House of Commons. For them, the House of Commons role is not even constitutive. Their selection is a matter for the Prime Minister. The House of Commons can hold the Prime Minister to account for it. The House of Commons could throw out a Prime Minister for it. But the MPs can throw a Prime Minister out for anything. They don't appoint cabinet ministers. It comes as news to MPs when they hear whom the Queen is appointing on the advice of her Prime Minister. Thirdly, the ministers are not ministers of the House of Commons. They're ministers of the Crown. The Occidental Revolution made them dependent on and accountable to the House of Commons. It did not make them, in their ministerial capacity, into agents of the House of Commons, as good committee members are agents. I think that these are drawbacks in Bagehot's illuminating account. Perhaps the fusion idea and the idea that the House of Commons elects cabinet ministers as committee members are best understood as a rather figurative way of highlighting something worth attending to, the specific importance of the cabinet in the Westminster model. That is a central element in the achievement of responsible government in the UK. Imagine how different it would be if we had ended up with a model in which the Prime Minister is the only minister of the Crown, accountable to the House of Commons, but with all of government conducted by subordinates answerable only to the Prime Minister. Imagine how much less that would do to secure responsible government. The cabinet system focuses and intensifies accountability in the House of Commons and makes the Prime Minister accountable directly every day to a group of leading figures from his or her own party. The Prime Minister can dismiss them, and they must generally adhere to the government line, but the Prime Minister must generally take a government line that they will adhere to. When politics makes it unavoidable, they're under the Prime Minister's thumb. When politics makes it possible, they are equipped to oppose the Prime Minister by resigning, as Boris Johnson did under Theresa May. The Prime Minister may be more or less able to dismiss a minister, but cannot survive without ministers. And it is of great symbolic importance that the other ministers are not the Prime Minister's personal appointees or servants, but servants of the Crown holding office on the Prime Minister's advice. Bagehot might have pointed out that in the construction of this new and crucial institution, the Cabinet, the House of Commons does nothing, does not appoint anyone, and does not advise the Queen. So it seems to me to be a mistake to call the Cabinet a committee of the legislature. Even though, needless to say, the Prime Minister's success in politics, and therefore in the House of Commons, will depend on the Cabinet, and the Cabinet intensifies the Prime Minister's accountability to the House of Commons simply by making it the case that other persons than the Prime Minister will have to stand up and answer questions about the government's policy. I wonder, though, if Bagehot got his idea that the Cabinet is a committee of the House of Commons because the politics of the Cabinet worked rather differently in 1867 than in 2020. I don't know enough about Victorian politics to say. It was the heyday of a rather different form of politicking within the House of Commons, a time when party organization was different and perhaps looser, so that perhaps there was some sense to the idea that the Cabinet was rather like a committee of the House of Commons. But I don't think that is an essential element in the Westminster model. What is essential is that the monarch chooses a prime minister on the basis of the representation of parties in the House of Commons. She chooses and may dismiss the other ministers on the advice of the prime minister. The ministers take collective responsibility, and the ministry can be voted out by the House of Commons. As a result of all this, and the government's control over the timetable in the House of Commons and its sole power over initiative of money bills, the Prime Minister is very powerful when it's all going right and is very dramatically exposed to political danger when things are not going right. That supports responsible government. The danger doesn't even depend on a vote of no confidence. The Prime Minister's party will destroy him or her if the MPs decide that the Prime Minister is a liability. Just think of Anthony Eden or Margaret Thatcher. Here's one lesson of the Occidental Revolution. If we understand it properly, we can puncture a central myth of British constitutional lore. The myth that the executive is the bad branch of government and the legislature and the judiciary are the good branches. In a crucial sense of the word government, of course, the executive is the government. It is the general operative branch. The legislative and judicial branches only exist to carry out certain specific functions that cannot be carried out responsibly by the executive. They are essential to responsible government. But legislative and judicial action have specific forms. The legislature approves taxes and other general measures for the future. The judiciary determines particular questions of legal right and wrong retrospectively. That's why lawyers and judges have to be historians. The executive operates in real time with a view to present action. It's the only branch that does not close for vacations. It is never prorogued or adjourned. Even the initiation of legislation is an executive function. In a pandemic, the country cannot rely on the legislature. It needs the executive to bring proposals to the legislature. I'm not exactly trying to talk everyone out of their very English distrust of executive power. I just want to point out that a general constitutional policy of taking power away from the executive would be absurd. Taking the legislative power away, taking the judicial power away from the executive, these were good ideas because there is a particular rationale in each case to secure integrity in adjudication and to give voters political control over taxation and other lawmaking. Any measure to disempower the executive must have a particular rationale. We do not need an executive with less power. We need the executive to be extraordinarily powerful, to fight a pandemic, or to provide for education, or to operate prisons, or to build highways, or to deal with other countries and other international actors. And that need, our need, explains the importance of the Occidental Revolution. It is not enough to take power away from the executive. If we are to achieve responsible government, we need to configure the executive to exercise great power responsibly. The Occidental Revolution was important first for the way it transformed the United Kingdom, and secondly, for the model it offered for the beginnings of decolonization starting in the 1860s. The Canadian colonial leaders did not need a Thomas Jefferson or a James Madison. their one principle was responsible government, and they did not need to theorize its underlying more abstract principles because they had a very practical living paradigm, the Westminster model in the 1860s. They used the term responsible government as a slogan for making the executive government of the colony accountable to an assembly of representatives of property holders in the colony rather than to the Colonial Office in London. That explains the British North America Act. They wanted to be so close to the Westminster model that they asked for the new country to be called the Kingdom of Canada. The last thing the Americans had wanted in 1787 was to call their new polity the Kingdom of America. In 1867, the imperial government didn't like kingdom and they insisted on calling it the Dominion of Canada. But they gave the Canadians what they really wanted, and in particular, the names: Parliament, House of Commons, Prime Minister. The Canadians got strong executive government by a ministry that would be entirely at the mercy of an assembly of people like them. The resulting creation of a constitution with a parliament was a landmark, but I don't know that Canada even influenced other settler colonies that would take up this model. Leaders in other colonies seeking decolonization had little in common with the wealthy men who were building up the logging industry and the fisheries and the railways in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the Canadas. And yet, they did have this thing in common: they were motivated by the same attractions. It shows the adaptability of the framework. Responsible government became a phrase in Canada and across the empire, a slogan for a form of self-government in which the colony's executive was made dependent on the confidence of a colonial assembly rather than on the directives of the Colonial Office in London. Listen to the preamble to the 1919 Government of India Act. It is the declared policy of Parliament to provide for the gradual development of self-governing institutions with a view to the progressive realization of responsible government in British India as an integral part of the empire. Well, progressive realization of responsible government meant incomplete realization. But when the Indian leaders achieved independence, they still wanted responsible government. At independence, when Dr. Ambedkar, the genius who drafted the Constitution of India, traveled the planet in his mind, looting other people's constitutions for useful ideas, he took this one central element from the UK. The President of India appoints a Prime Minister by reference to the result of elections to the lower house of a parliament, and appoints other ministers on the advice of the Prime Minister and acts on the advice of the ministers. And the ministers are subject to dismissal on a vote of no confidence in the lower house. That gives India, like the UK, a strong executive government that is totally at the mercy of the people's representatives in the legislature. Let me close by highlighting another chord in Bagehot's book that resonates with British constitutionalism in the 21st century. It is the tendency of British and political and legal thought to play down the success of our Occidental Revolution through a generalized hostility toward executive power. Bagehot said, "One of the most curious peculiarities of the English people is its dislike of the executive government. By definition, a nation calling itself free should have no jealousy of the executive, for freedom means that the nation, the political part of the nation, wields the executive. We look on state action not as our own action, but as alien action." Here he's describing this foible of British political thought, that we look on executive action as an imposed tyranny from without, not as the consummated result of our own organized wishes. Well, like the English people of 1867 that Bagehot's talking about, you may be skeptical about the Occidental Revolution. Its results seem to be fragile and tenuous because it leaves good government to depend utterly on something that is rare and delicate, healthy party politics. But in defense of the Westminster model, we should remember that if politics is entirely useful for the public good, no constitutional system will solve the problem. It's only a constitution, after all. Dr. Ambedkar said of the Indian constitution when they had finished writing it, "If I may say so, if things go wrong under the new constitution, the reason will not be that we had a bad constitution. What we will have to say is that man was vile." And isn't it interesting that the Westminster scheme works fairly well in such a wide variety of suboptimal political cultures and practices in the UK, in India, in a wide variety of states, and in various times and various conditions. Like any constitution, it can be undermined and manipulated. It could be made into a sham. Yet, it has a strong tendency to make suboptimal politics work better than it might. And if you think about it, that is a wonderful thing to get from a constitution. The main reason why we get that from the Westminster model, the main reason why it makes suboptimal politics work better, is the vulnerability of the Prime Minister's position. Even a Prime Minister as powerful and as accomplished as Margaret Thatcher. The role of the opposition in the House of Commons is essential, and even that reflects the importance of the executive and of its relation to the legislature. The privileges given the opposition in the House of Commons, the shadow ministers, even the furniture, present the opposition in the House and to the nation as an executive in waiting. In argument in the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom in Gina Miller's second case last September, Lord Keane, arguing for the government, said of members of Parliament, "They're not just there to hold them to account. They're there to replace them." That's the central strength of the Occidental Revolution. Of course, in 2020, not everyone thinks that the Westminster model is good enough. Each of Gina Miller's triumphs in the UK Supreme Court was, in its way, a vote of no confidence by our judges in the Westminster model. In 2017, 8 out of 11 justices in the Supreme Court concluded that the Prime Minister's proposed use of the prerogative power to take a decision that would lead to the cancellation of the EU treaty would have a constitutional effect too great for the matter to be trusted to the executive. In 2019, in Gina Miller's second case, all 11 justices concluded that the timetable of Parliament's meetings needed to be protected by law against the executive. With respect, I think that we would have lost nothing if the judges had, instead, accepted the outcome of the Occidental Revolution. The dissenting view in Miller No. 1, the view of 3 out of the 11 Supreme Court justices, would have left the Prime Minister free to take the UK out of the European Union, subject to the ordinary subjection of all her conduct to control by the House of Commons. I think that would have sustained responsible government. and neither the Westminster model nor the judges can secure good government. In Miller No. 2, the decision of 3 senior judges in the Divisional Court, which was rejected by all 11 Supreme Court justices, would have sustained responsible government. It would have left the prorogation of Parliament to the ordinary politics, to the relation between the Prime Minister and the House of Commons, negotiated by politicians. Perhaps Lady Hale and Lord Reid were right in the reasons they wrote for the unanimous court, to say in the first paragraph of their reasons that the case was a one-off. The one-off situation was an artifact of the Brexit politics, was a situation in which the House of Commons had no confidence in the government, but did not choose to throw it out, or even to agree to Boris Johnson's motions under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act for an early election. And the Fixed Term Parliaments Act was, like Gina Miller's cases, an attempt to secure responsible government that reflected a distrust of the outcome of the Occidental Revolution. I think the distrust is unfounded. I'll have to explain that opinion about the Fixed Term Parliaments Act in the discussion if there's time. Here is another of Walter Bagehot's really penetrating remarks about our Constitution. I think it focuses the question in the 21st century. The whole life of English politics is the action and reaction between the ministry and the Parliament. It's beautiful. Let me say it again. The whole life of English politics is the action and reaction between the ministry and Parliament. Gina Miller went to court in both her cases to stand up for the role of Parliament. But perhaps the problem in both cases was that she and the justices of the Supreme Court were not content to trust the whole life of English politics to the action and reaction between the ministry and the Parliament. They were not content with the outcome of the Occidental Revolution. For a long time, between 1867 and today, I have no doubt, the outcome of the Occidental Revolution was sustained by smug complacency. Smug complacency is a stupid frame of mind. But here is one irony of our Constitution. A bit of smug complacency at the right points is as useful for the public good as an intelligent appreciation of the strengths of the Constitution. And so in 2020, we face a crisis of constitutional culture. The crisis is that smug complacency is in short supply. The judges of the Supreme Court showed none whatsoever in either of Gina Miller's cases. They showed a readiness to listen to advocates for each side in litigation, to listen to their arguments as to what would secure responsible government for the present and the future in the UK. Without the smug complacency, we're in this rather concerning situation. Lacking the complacency that might keep a constitution on track, our need is now acute for an intelligent appreciation instead of the surprisingly rugged constitutional form that Britain won through the arduous struggles of the Occidental Revolution. Walter Bagehot sometimes suggested that this constitutional form, our Westminster model, is the only way of attaining responsible government, and that the American Constitution, for example, had fatal defects that undermined responsible government. I don't say that. And at his best, Bagehot would certainly agree that it depends on political and cultural and social and educational conditions in a nation. There are other ways of making government less selfish. But the Westminster model with a strong executive entirely at the mercy of a legislative assembly, with politicians negotiating the relationship, is a very good way. As useful to constitutionalism as the arch is to architecture.